Our guest here this week on Ascend Conservatism is the Vice President of the United States. Now, he's just a few minutes late, so he's just walking in the studio right this second. Oh, Mr. Vice President, are you okay?
Yes.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Please sit down. Now, it is truly an honor to have the Vice President of the United States here on Ascend Conservatism. I was a little worried that after last week's hard-hitting interview I did with former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, that you might rescind your offer to join us here this week on War Radio. I hope you're not worried about us being unfair to you.
I'm not worried about that. You know what I'm worried about?
Well, what are you worried about?
Kim Jong-il.
Is he in relation to the lead singer of Motley Crue, Vince Neil?
Yes.
Interesting. I didn't know that. So, did you hear the interview with Miss Pelosi?
Yes.
Oh, by the way, do you know her personally?
She's a truly close personal friend.
Ooh, sorry to hear that. Now let's get to the meat of the program. Before you were tabbed as the vice presidential candidate, Barack Obama asked you your opinion on what you thought about him asking Zach Galifianakis to be his VP. What did you tell him?
It might have been a better pick than me.
I think you're right. Well, let's jump right into the first days of this administration back in 2009. Since you have been in government for almost a half a century, what did you tell the sadly inexperienced President Obama about how FDR handled that stock market crash back in 1929?
Franklin Roosevelt got on television.
You do know that the first president to send out a televised address was almost 20 years after that?
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Well, actually, it's a known historical fact.
Not true.
Well, let's agree to disagree. Dolt.
Who the hell are you talking to?
My apologies, Mr. Vice President. So let's move on. Now, you had been in the Senate for over 40 years, and you have been Vice President for over 5, and you have met with hundreds and hundreds of world leaders. Can you give us an example of, let's see, what did you discuss with the Prime Minister of one of our closest allies in the world, India?
You cannot go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent.
Are you serious?
Absolutely, positively.
Isn't that an insult to all the Indian people?
I know.
Well, heck, if it doesn't bother you. Now, some of our listeners out there might not really understand what the Vice President's role is in an administration. Can you tell us what was the main thing as Vice President of the United States do you try to do?
Trying to get black men to understand it's not unmanly to wear a condom.
Okay. Let's move on.
I got tested for AIDS. I know Barack got tested for AIDS.
Thanks for sharing. Please, let's continue. Coming into the President's first days, what were your words of wisdom for someone like President Obama, who had absolutely zero accomplishments before being elected on basically what turned out to be a mainstream media-driven con job?
Our agenda is not going to be worth very much.
Well, at least you were honest from day one. Probably the only one in this rotten-to-the-core administration.
I know.
Now, I would like to move on to some of the many and still mounting Obama scandals.
Oh, I'd love that.
Good. Let's get started. Now, let's be honest. There are so many scandals that it's hard to keep track without a scorecard.
It's incredible.
It is pretty laughable.
Yes.
So would you like me to expose what President Obama and his paid liar Jay Carney call phony scandals?
Oh, I'd love that.
Good. Let's go. Let's start with Obama's taxpayer-funded kickbacks to his 1%er crony campaign donors at the green energy scams like Solyndra, Light Squared, and Ener1, to name just a few.
It's a disturbing pattern.
Yes, it is. It's Chicago pay-for-play crooked politics. Then there was this administration snooping on the Associated Press, massive NSA invasion into the privacy of every U.S. citizen, the Department of Justice intimidating reporters like FNC's Rosen, intimidating whistleblowers, and intimidating its own inspectors general. Now let's talk about the Fast and Furious scandal that had its investigation stopped in its tracks by President Obama's constitutionally questionable use of executive privilege. After so many months of denying that Attorney General Eric Holder and himself, the President, had no knowledge of Holder's underlings sending over 3,500 weapons to the Sonora drug cartel in Mexico, Once the Oversight Committee asked for communications between Holt and Obama regarding this operation that caused massive bloodshed, the president claimed executive privilege over documents that they had previously said did not exist. Now, isn't the use of executive privilege tantamount to an admission from Obama that he knew of or did indeed order Fast and Furious?
Absolutely.
I'm glad we agree on this. So what do you say to the Kool-Aid crowd that calls it a phony scandal when an operation kills 2 border agents and gets hundreds of Mexican citizens slaughtered in this operation?
They're engaged in denial.
Bingo! Now, what do you say to Holder and the president on coming clean about the Fast and Furious?
It's about time they take some responsibility here.
I also hope they come clean someday. Should we continue with the plethora of Obama scandals?
We should continue.
Let's go to the ever-evolving IRS scandal.
I love that.
Good. So let's talk about the high-ranking IRS official Lois Lerner, who asked for immunity from prosecution, as well as invoking her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination not once, but twice.
It's incredible.
I know, right? But wasn't it President Obama who said this?
The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
So obviously, Lerner and this administration have something to hide.
Exactly.
What about these loons who say that the IRS is a phony scandal?
They're engaged in denial.
That seems to be a prerequisite for people who still approve of this president, don't you think?
Yes.
Now I'd like to throw you a curveball. Here's a scandal I'd like your opinion on, that the mainstream media has swept under the rug. Before the Boston bombing, the FBI was warned by Russia that the Chechens inside the U.S. were dangerous, and in fact, told then specifically to investigate Tsarnaev. In the interim, the Obama administration slashed the domestic bomb prevention budget in half. Now, in your opinion, aren't these direct factors that led to the deaths and maiming of our citizens in the first terror attack on U.S. soil since 9/11?
Absolutely.
Can you please explain to our listeners why the media covered this up?
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Now, on last week's show, we documented all of this administration's lies in reference to the Benghazi cover-up. So we won't repeat them this week. But can you sum up the pathetic YouTube lie for us, as well as the many, many lies this president has told over the last 5 years?
It's a disturbing pattern.
It truly is. Now let's move on to foreign policy. Just months before you and President Obama took office in 2009, you stated that the freshman senator from Illinois with absolutely no discerning qualities to be president and zero accomplishments was not ready to be president.
Absolutely, positively, unequivocally.
Okay, so let's run down the line of Mr. Obama's foreign policy failures, and then you can give our listeners your take on the subject.
Oh, I love that.
Let's start off with the president coming out in the early days and saying that his foreign policy doctrine would be leading from behind. What do you think the world's impression of that was?
The rest of the world, including our own Defense Department, including our State Department, knows that would be folly.
It was that obvious?
Yes.
So what did you tell Mr. Obama about his clueless and naive foreign policy plan?
Mr. President, this is ridiculous. There is no plan.
Interesting. Let's move on. Straight out of the gate, he sent Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Russia to reset relations between the two countries. Now, with Putin running roughshod over our impotent president in Ukraine, wouldn't you call the reset an abject failure?
Unequivocally.
After the ludicrous reset, Obama went on a world apology tour and stopped off in Egypt and gave the pathetic and ridiculous Cairo speech. In this sad attempt to appease Islam, he manufactured his own history. He lied and said that the Muslim world created the compass, pens, and printing.
It's incredible.
I know, laughable lies. Anyone with a high school degree knows these were actually invented in Asia. But of course, President Obama and the truth are rarely in the same hemisphere at the same time.
Exactly.
Even after this sad pandering to Muslims, his approval rating today is actually lower than the much vilified George W. Bush.
That's not presidential leadership.
I agree with you, Mr. Vice President, 100%.
Come on, let's get out and get something to eat.
We're not done with the interview, Mr. Biden.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Let's continue. Let's move on to Iraq. You and then Senator Obama were against President Bush's surge that turned out to be hugely successful and basically ended serious combat operations in Iraq. Oh, and on the side note, not only were you against the surge, but you were also against the first Gulf War that also had UN approval and where George H.W. Bush ran Saddam cowering back to Baghdad.
Yes.
In a sweeping military victory that the world had never seen. It occurs to me that when it comes to foreign policy, you are absolutely clueless.
Who the hell are you talking to?
My apologies again. But you have to admit, you are on the wrong side of history about 99% of the time.
I know.
So what did President Obama tell his cabinet in regard to Iraq after his inauguration?
Joe will do Iraq. I didn't know. So Joe did Iraq, and my job is to end the war.
Oh, really? And did you end the war in Iraq?
Absolutely, positively, unequivocally.
But let me clarify one thing about who ended the war in Iraq.
Oh, I'd love that.
In the U.S.-Iraq Status of Forces Agreement, it was an agreement between Iraq and the United States signed by President Bush in 2008. It established that the U.S. combat forces would withdraw from Iraqi cities in June 30, 2009, and all U.S. forces will be completely out of Iraq by December 31st, 2011. Now, since the war was ended in December 2011 as the troops left Iraq, all due to George Bush's agreement, isn't it disingenuous to say that you and Barack Obama, quote-unquote, ended the war in Iraq?
I think that I stand by the statement.
So why in the 2012 campaign did President Obama continue this shameless lie that he indeed ended the war in Iraq?
This is a bunch of stuff.
By stuff, you mean horse manure.
Exactly.
So don't you agree that this pathological lying by President Obama is disturbing?
It's a disturbing pattern.
Yes, it is. Let's talk about Israel right now. In the campaign, you and Senator Obama promised to bring peace to the Middle East. What was the result of the president's policies in aspect to Israel and Hamas?
Israel is in more jeopardy. Hezbollah is stronger. All because of this president's policies.
So, would you say that Obama's Middle East policy is an abject failure also?
Yes.
So what was the reason for that?
Incompetence.
Seems like a running theme through this administration.
I know.
Now, can you please give us, in one phrase, characterizing President Obama on the world stage?
He's the biggest appeaser we've had in modern history.
Those are harsh words for your boss.
This is unconscionable.
Well, now I know from past interviews that I have seen you on that this question always gets you highly upset. But can you please explain to us what is the cause of President Obama's many foreign policy disasters? And can you do it in just 2 words?
Absolute incompetence.
Ouch! Now what, if anything, you as the second in command of the United States would do if these international blunders continue?
I would lead an effort to impeach him.
And why is that?
It's time to be patriotic.
So you call impeaching Barack Obama patriotic?
Yes.
That's interesting, because I want to ask you about Libya.
Oh, I'd love that.
Great. Please, tell us. What did you say to President Obama before he violated the War Powers Act and bombed Libya without even bothering to get congressional approval?
I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee for 17 years, or its ranking member. I teach separation of powers and constitutional law. This is something I know. So I got together and brought a group of constitutional scholars together to write a piece that I'm going to deliver to the whole United States Senate, pointing out the president has no constitutional authority to take this nation to war unless we're attacked or unless there is proof that we are about to be attacked. And if he does, I would move to impeach him.
So what did the president tell you when you told him you were going to impeach him since he went ahead and bombed Libya unilaterally anyway?
Do you want to stay in that job?
Ooh, that's a harsh threat.
Exactly.
So is it a correct statement to say that you sold out your principles just to keep your job?
Absolutely.
Sellout.
Who the hell are you talking to?
Sorry about that. Let's move on. Now we are getting close to the end of our interview.
Come on, let's get out and get something to eat.
We will, Mr. Vice President. You must be hungry.
Yes.
So let's wind down our interview then. Before we go, I want to first invite you to listen in on the second part of our show. the section that we call CFJ's Liberal Education Annex.
Oh, I'd love that.
We will be educating the low-info left on who truly caused the Great Recession and the disasters of the Obama economic policies.
There is no plan.
Relax.
Let's calm down a little bit
Okay,
here.
let's. Since it will be an economic segment, and since the president tabbed you to be in charge of the recovery website,
Do you know the website number?
we'll tell you that at dinner. Now, since you were in charge of parts of the economic stimulus package, what was your first priority for recovery?
Three-letter word. Jobs. J-O-B-S.
3 letters, huh? Okie dokie. Now I would like to give you an economic quiz, as I did with Ms. Pelosi. I have to tell you, Dingbat Pelosi failed miserably.
Figures.
It's a simple Econ 101 question. Are you ready?
Yes.
What's 2 plus 2?
I just don't know.
So why in the heck did Obama tab you to work on the economic recovery?
It's unconscionable.
And now that we come to the close of our interview with Vice President Joe Biden, I just want to thank him for coming in, and I really think that it really gave us an insight on what's wrong with this country.